Daniel Batchelor here, Powder River Precision. We're going to go over our newest trigger kit. It's for the Ruger LC9S and LC9S Pro. Before we start, we're going to go ahead and make sure the gun's clear. It's clear, and Ruger gives you these handy dandy magazine inserts. This gun has a magazine disconnect if it's the LC9S. The Pro does not have a magazine disconnect, and it does not have a manual thumb safety. Before I put the kit in, I want to go ahead and test the trigger pull on this gun as it was from the factory. Just about 4.5 pounds. Go ahead and check it again. All right. So to disassemble the gun, we're going to push this cover plate down. We're going to line up that notch with the takedown pin, and we're going to push the takedown pin out from this side. So pull the slide back, push out the takedown pin, and let the slide forward. If it's cocked, you're going to need to pull the trigger to release the slide. Slide comes off, and we'll set it to the side. This kit doesn't have any parts that go in the slide. They all go in the frame, and they're a sear and a trigger pivot. So we're not changing any springs. We're changing the geometry of these parts to lower the weight, to shorten the pre-travel and the over-travel. It gives you a nice, smooth, clean brake. Yeah, go ahead and take the block out. We don't need that anymore. And I'm going to remove the front and rear insert pins. Those just push right out. I'm using one of our 4mm punches. Actually, it's 4.5mm. After the insert pins are out, we can push up on the frame insert, and this cover plate's going to come loose here in just a second. We'll set that off to the side and remove the frame insert from the grip frame. Set that off to the side. The trigger spring is under tension here, so we're going to pull it down counterclockwise and release it clockwise to that position. The trigger bar comes off. It was sitting on the trigger pivot pin there and grabbing hold of the lock lifter in the back. This gun has a trigger safety, and we're going to remove that pin most of the way, just enough to release the trigger safety. There's a very small spring that sits in there. Set that off to the side. We're going to turn it upside down so we're looking at the bottom of it, and there's a trigger pin that goes through the trigger pivot, through the trigger spring, and holds all that together. You push from the bottom, and it comes out through that hole in the top. Right there. Once that comes out, it's going to release the trigger spring, and then we're going to push the trigger pivot, pull that out. This one is not the Pro, so it has the magazine disconnect. We're going to push that forward and lift the trigger up, set that off to the side. This is under spring tension, so it'll slide back. We can lift that out. And there's a magazine disconnect spring. Go ahead and set that off to the side as well. We're going to remove the manual safety by lifting it up. There's a little form spring here that clicks it in and out for a detent. Be careful not to lose that spring. Set that off to the side, and then the form spring. I'm going to push the sear pin from the left side to the right just far enough to release the ejector, the sear, and the sear spring. Before I do that, I'm going to release the tension on the sear spring by hooking the top leg and moving it to the right, and that releases this leg here. We're not going to push this out so far that we release the block lifter. That's going to stay in. Sear spring. The sear is going to move out the bottom. So it's going to come out this cavity here on the bottom. Lost my sear pin. That's going to go back in. The reason I'm keeping the sear pin in there is so that we don't release the block lifter and the block lifter spring. Then I'm going to lift up the ejector. I'm going to take the new sear that comes in the kit, slide it up from the bottom. Use a punch to lift it up, and you gotta pull the sear over to get past the little boss. You use a 3mm punch from the opposite side to line it up so that the pin goes through. Using the pin to hold the sear in place like that, we're going to put the sear spring in. There's a bent leg and a straight leg. The straight leg is going to go down towards the bottom, and the bent leg is going to be on the top. Just like that. Use a punch to line it up, and then the ejector is going to slide in right next to that. There's also a little round boss on the ejector, so I'm going to slide the sear over while I put that in. Push the sear pin through all of the pieces. Use a small punch. I'm going to tension the leg by moving it to the right and pushing it down. And it catches on a little slot in the frame there. Take the manual safety, and it's going to install here. The safety should move up, and this surface on the safety will move up and block that lug on the sear. If the safety doesn't go all the way up, you may have to fit that surface on the sear. This one's working properly. Grab the manual safety spring, The large end is going to go towards the top of the frame. Like that. And then I use my thumb to hold it in place and push the bottom down to tension it against the safety. That's it for the back. On the front, we're going to start with the magazine disconnect. This surface on the disconnect locks on that surface on the trigger, blocking the trigger. When the magazine's inserted, it moves forward and allows the trigger to pivot. If the kit goes in and the safety or the disconnect isn't working properly, you may need to fit on that surface a little bit. And sometimes there's a little burr from the stamping process. So just a few quick strokes with the jeweler's file to smooth out that burr. It's not a lot of material. Take the magazine disconnect spring, sits in that slot. This little peg on the back is going to center up in that spring, slides forward with a little bit of pressure forward. I'm going to install the trigger, and then I'm going to install the trigger pivot. This surface of the trigger pivot controls your over travel. And this surface back here is what we're using to eliminate the pre-travel. The pre-travel is also related to the reset in the back. So if it's not resetting, you might take a little material off of this surface here so it rotates further back. Install the trigger spring in the 3 o'clock position. Hold that in place and put the trigger pin through the top, linking the trigger pivot, the trigger spring, and the trigger. Make sure it's fully seated. Going to take the trigger safety with the trigger safety spring, install that in the trigger, and use a punch to reinsert the pin, making sure it's flush or just slightly below. Take the trigger bar, place it on the peg on the trigger pivot, pushing it up in the back. That's upside down, so that it engages the block lifter in the back. In that position, I'm going to tension the trigger spring by rotating it counterclockwise and hooking it into the trigger bar. Once that's done, we're going to start to install it in the frame. Once it's in about that position, we'll get our cover plate, set that in place, and slide it all down. Take your insert pins. We're going to seat those. Making sure they're flush on both sides. We're going to push the cover plate down. Make sure your Safety is in the down position. Slide the slide on. You're going to pull it back so the window lines up with the pinhole. And insert the takedown pin. Make sure the pin is fully seated. The cover plate snaps back up. Magazine disconnect is working. Manual safety is working. And the trigger safety is working. So there's your take up, trigger pull, over travel stops, and a nice short reset. Check the trigger pull weight and see how we did. Or in between 3.5 and 4 pounds. Thanks for watching.